How did you even get past the gate? The property sent me an alert. An alert. You always find a reason to show up where you're not wanted.
Brooke? Seriously? Tonight of all nights?
Looks like quite a party in there.
Mom and Dad deserve one nice evening without drama. Can you just not do this?
Looks like quite a party in there.
Mom and Dad deserve one nice evening without drama. Can you just not do this? Then go find yourself a hotel. We're not leaving.
My family had been inside that mansion for hours before I arrived at the gate. They were laughing, pouring wine, already making plans to come back without a single thought about who might be watching. When Mallory told me to leave, she said it the way people do when they're completely sure of themselves. She was sure of the wrong thing. The reason that property had been alerting my phone all night was the one detail she never thought to ask about. How much would it cost her when she found out? If you've ever felt like the most capable person in your family, and somehow still the least seen, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, and it is far from over. The gate alert came through at 9:47 in the evening. I was still on the highway 40 minutes outside of Franklin when my phone lit up with the first notification. Then a second. Then a third. I assumed it was one of the They had been finishing up some final details in the kitchen, and it wouldn't have been the first time someone forgot to sign out of the security system before leaving. I pulled over on the shoulder, opened the app, and looked at the camera feed. It was not the contractors. I need to explain something about my family before I explain what I saw on that screen, because none of what happened that night makes sense without it. Gordon and Patricia Langford were not cruel people. They were the kind of parents who responded to noise and mistook silence for contentment, and I had never been a loud person. My brother Trevor was loud in the way people are when they've made a mess and need someone to help them clean it up. There was always a financial decision that hadn't worked out, a loan that needed covering, a situation that required the family to mobilize around him. My sister Mallory was loud in a different way. She was the one who filled rooms, who made occasions feel like events, who had a talent for becoming the center of any gathering so naturally that nobody ever questioned whether she deserved to be there. Between the two of them, they absorbed most of what our parents had to give: attention, time, money, patience. I was the one who made it easy. I solved my own problems. I paid my own bills. I showed up when I was needed and didn't make demands when I wasn't, and my family took that as a sign that I was fine. The truth is that I was fine mostly, but there is a difference between being capable of handling things alone and being expected to, and that difference had been accumulating in me for a long time. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I had stopped waiting for my parents to notice the gap. I turned everything I had been holding into fuel and built something with it instead. The company came out of a combination of necessity and stubbornness. I had spent several years working in healthcare logistics, and I understood the supply chain problems that private hospital networks were dealing with well enough to know there was a business in solving them. Starting it nearly broke me in ways I never told anyone about. There were stretches of months where the numbers didn't hold, where I made decisions at midnight that I wasn't sure I'd be able to defend by morning, where the margin between staying open and folding was thin enough that I could see through it. My family knew I worked a lot. They attributed this to personality rather than necessity, which suited me fine. Sharing difficulty with the Langfords meant inviting their involvement, and their involvement had a way of producing outcomes I hadn't agreed to. So I kept the hard parts to myself, and after nearly a decade of keeping them, the hard parts finally gave way to something else. The contracts grew. The company stabilized. By the time I turned 39, I had built the kind of financial position that my family would not have imagined for me, because they had stopped imagining much for me at all. I didn't hide what I had out of bitterness. I hid it because I understood what visibility would cost me. They would not see success. They would see a larger source of support, and I was not willing to become that. The estate on Redwood Hollow Drive had been 2 years in the finding. It was a stone mansion, a formal entrance hall with high ceilings, a library, a dining room large enough to seat 20, a pool flanked by a terraced garden, and enough land that you couldn't see another structure from the back porch. I bought it through a holding company which kept my name clear of public records. My attorney, Jocelyn Barrett, knew the full picture. The brokerage team knew. A handful of contractors did too, under confidentiality agreements. Nobody else. I wasn't being secretive for drama. I was protecting something I had never had before, a space that was entirely mine, where no one had a claim, a key, or an expectation. The final walkthrough was scheduled for 10 the following morning. I had been looking forward to it the way you look forward to something you've spent years working toward and haven't let yourself fully believe in yet. When I saw the camera feed and realized what was happening, my first instinct was exactly what you'd expect. I drove straight to the gate, put in the code, and walked to that front door. That was the conversation you heard at the beginning, Mallory blocking the entrance, Trevor appearing at her shoulder with a glass in his hand, my mother coming through from the dining room to tell me that tonight was not the night, that whatever I wanted could wait, that this was their anniversary, and I was the disruption. They had no idea whose house they were standing in, and I hadn't told them yet, and in that moment I made a decision that changed everything about how the rest of the night unfolded. I could have told them right then. I had every right to. But if I had, they would have apologized, recalibrated, and spent the rest of the night managing the revelation rather than sitting inside it. Mallory would have reframed it as a spontaneous mistake. My mother would have found the words that made it smaller than it was. And by morning, the version of events that survived would be the one they had constructed, not the one I had witnessed. I wanted the version I had witnessed. So I told them nothing, walked back to my car, pulled out onto the side road a quarter-mile from the property, and kept the camera feed running on my phone. What I saw in the next hour was worth every minute of that wait. There were at least 20 cars along the front drive. The entrance hall, which I had walked through a dozen times during renovation and always found quiet and half-finished, was full of people I recognized. There were flower arrangements on the center table, balloon clusters near the staircase. Someone had assembled a catering setup along the far wall, and champagne was being circulated on a tray. My father was near the fireplace raising a glass while someone made a toast. My mother was beside him laughing at something. And Mallory was standing on the staircase, the one I had specifically told the contractors to keep off limits until the railing brackets were fully secured, posing for a photograph with the confident ease of someone who had never been told the word belonged to anyone else. I kept moving through the cameras. The kitchen had been taken over. Someone had gone into the refrigerator, the one with a contractor's note still taped to the front, and found the bottles I had stored there for the move-in. Trevor was holding one of them, reading the label with the particular expression he gets when he's impressed by something that didn't cost him anything. Then I heard my name come through the audio. Mallory was talking to the woman beside her, not bothering to lower her voice. Something about my apartment. Something about how I was probably at my desk working same as always. Trevor picked it up from there. He told the small group around him that I had never figured out how to actually enjoy my life. A woman I recognized as one of my father's cousins looked around the entrance hall at the stone walls, the high ceilings, the chandelier that had taken the installation crew 3 days to hang, and asked whether anyone could imagine me living somewhere like this. The room laughed. Not cruelly, just easily, the way people laugh at something they've already decided is obvious. I stayed on that side road for a long time after that. Every few minutes I told myself I had enough to work with and I should call Jocelyn and begin the process of removing everyone. And every few minutes something else would come through the audio feed. Another comment, another laugh, another casual assumption about who I was and what I was capable of, and I would stay a little longer. Not out of masochism. Out of the recognition that I was hearing something I had never been meant to hear, and that what I learned in the next few hours would not just decide what happened to the mansion. It would decide what I did with everything that came after it. That was when I located my cousin Curtis in the frame. Curtis ran a small event rental operation out of a warehouse east of Nashville, folding chairs, linens, portable lighting rigs, the kind of inventory that made him useful to people planning parties on short notice. One of his employees had made multiple deliveries to the mansion during the renovation. That was how Curtis knew the property was nearly finished and still unoccupied. It was also, I understood watching him now, how he had obtained the temporary gate code the contractors had used for deliveries, a code that no one had thought to reset when the last truck pulled out. Curtis had found an unlocked door, worked out the combination, and brought the entire family through it without asking a single person for permission. Watching him move through my entrance hall on that camera feed, directing people, pointing out where to set up, the food acting, as though he had organized the whole event. Something settled in me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't rage. It was closer to clarity. I had spent years telling myself that my family was careless with me because they didn't fully think things through. Watching Curtis work that room, I understood that careless and thoughtless were not the same thing. What he had done required planning. What everyone else had agreed to required a decision. The footage kept recording. The party kept going, and I kept watching. The party grew louder as the night went on. I had my phone propped against the steering wheel, the car charger keeping the battery from dropping the main camera feed, holding steady on the screen in front of me. The coffee I had picked up on the highway was cold. I had stopped noticing. The conversation inside the mansion had shifted the way conversations do when people get comfortable away from the occasion and toward whatever was already on their minds. My mother started talking about me, not in a mean way. That was the part that took me a moment to absorb. She wasn't saying anything she would have been ashamed to repeat to my face. She was saying it in the easy, matter-of-fact tone people use when they're describing something that simply is the weather, the price of groceries, the particular nature of someone they've known for decades and stopped wondering about. She told the woman beside her that I had always been the one she didn't worry about, that I handled things, that some people just come out that way and she had been lucky with me. My father, a little further across the room, was saying something similar to two of his brothers. He acknowledged almost casually that they had spent more on Trevor over the years, more time, more financial support, more of the particular kind of attention you give to someone who keeps needing to be caught. Mallory, too, in different ways. He said it without apology because in his understanding of events he hadn't done anything that required one. I didn't need much. That was simply the truth of who I was, and it had made certain decisions easier. One of my aunts laughed and said I was useful in a way that most people weren't, that I always came through and never made you feel like you owed me anything afterward. She meant it as a compliment. I understood that. I also understood what it meant beneath the compliment, that my reliability had been mistaken consistently and across decades for a lack of need. The less I asked for, the more completely invisible those needs became. People don't worry about the one who handles things. They redirect that attention toward the ones who make noise because noise feels like urgency and silence feels like permission to look away. Trevor, standing near the bar that someone had assembled along the far wall of the dining room, told the group around him that whatever happened, I would always come through for the family in the end. He said it with a kind of fond certainty, the way you describe a rule of physics, not a person, but a reliable outcome. Mallory added that even when I was upset, I always came back, that it was just how I was built. She said it with a small laugh, and the people around her nodded along, and I sat in my car and understood that what they were describing was not my loyalty. It was their confidence that my loyalty had no limit. I saved that segment and kept watching. For a while, nothing rose above the general noise of a party going well. People refilled their glasses. Someone found a portable speaker and raised the music. I watched Mallory lead a group up the main staircase, ignoring the caution tape across the hallway to the unfinished east wing. Walking past it, the way people walk past signs they've decided don't apply to them. I watched Trevor open one of the second bottles from the refrigerator and distribute it without looking for glasses, just topping off whatever people were already holding. I watched a couple wander toward the far end of the entrance hall and try the handle on a door that led to a room still full of boxed furniture. When it opened, they went in. I added those to the folder. What changed the night? What made me reach for my phone with a different kind of intention happened first in the library. The library was one of the rooms I had been most specific about during renovation. The shelving had been custom built, the lighting adjusted 3 times to get it right, and the far wall had a pair of windows that looked out over the rear garden at an angle that caught the late afternoon light in a way I had never seen in any other room I'd owned. The door was supposed to be locked. It was not because someone had propped it open with a doorstop carried in from somewhere else, and my father and my uncle and Trevor were sitting in there talking in the low, easy way men talk when they believe the conversation is private. I almost switched to a different camera. Then I heard my name. What came out of that room over the next several minutes rearranged something in my understanding of my own history. Several years earlier, around 8 or 9 years back, when the company was still small enough that one bad quarter could have ended it, I had applied for a place in a business development program run through a regional commerce organization. It was competitive, the kind with a formal application, 2 rounds of interviews, and a structured cohort that met quarterly for 2 years. Getting in would have meant access to mentors, capital introductions, and a network that would have accelerated everything I was building. I had prepared the application over weeks. I had gotten through both interviews. And then in the window between the second interview and the selection announcement, I had been unreachable for about 4 days. A supplier crisis that sent me to Atlanta without much warning, during which I was handling things 18 hours a day and not monitoring my personal messages. I had always assumed the program had simply selected someone else. Sitting in my car on that side road, I learned that assumption had been built on a false foundation. During those 4 days, the program had called the family home. I had listed a secondary contact number for emergencies, a habit from the early years when I traveled frequently and cell coverage wasn't reliable. Trevor had taken the call. The program was doing a final verification confirming interest before the selection was made. And Trevor had told them in the unhurried and certain way he says most things that I was likely not going to be able to continue with the process, that I had significant family obligations that were making the timing difficult. My father knew. I understood that from the way he spoke about it in the library, not confessing, not justifying, but recounting as though it were a minor logistical detail from a chapter that had long since closed. He referenced the timing, the reason, the fact that at that point Trevor was in serious financial difficulty, and my parents had been leaning heavily on me. The unspoken logic was clear. If I had built the connections that program would have opened, I might have moved faster, gone further, possibly relocated. I would have become less available. And the version of me that was less available was a problem for a system that had been quietly running on my availability for years. No one asked what I wanted. No one told me what had happened. They made a calculation and moved on from it as though it were a minor logistical decision rather than a deliberate interference in the direction of my life. I sat with that for a long time. There is a specific feeling that comes with understanding that you were held back not by accident, but by people who loved you and found it convenient to keep you within reach. It isn't clean anger. It's something more complicated, a retroactive grief for a version of events you will never be able to fully trace, a recognition that the timeline you lived was shaped by a choice you never knew was being made. I had built everything I had built in spite of that interference, not because of it. I saved everything from the library and moved to a different camera. Back in the main hall, the party had continued to loosen. Guests had moved into the pool area. Someone had found the decorative storage cabinet in the downstairs hallway and was going through it. I watched a woman hold up a small glass piece I had bought at an estate sale in Savannah. One of the few personal items I had brought to the property early, examine it and set it down at an angle I knew would not hold. It fell about 12 minutes later and broke into 4 pieces on the tile floor. Then something happened that shifted the tone of the entire room, and not in the way the party had been shifting all evening. A man I recognized as one of my father's old colleagues, someone who had known our family for years, looked around the entrance hall with the slow appreciation of a person taking stock of something genuinely impressive. He turned to the group near the fireplace and said he hoped that one day Trevor or Mallory would reach the kind of success it took to own a place like this. It was the kind of toast people make without thinking, the kind that sounds like encouragement and functions as a verdict. Someone in the group. I couldn't see who asked the obvious follow-up. What about Brooke? The room didn't go quiet. The question just hung there for a moment, neither weighted nor dismissed, waiting for an answer. My father smiled. It was the small, slightly tired smile he gets when he's being asked to explain something he's already made peace with. He said I was hard-working. He said it genuinely without any intent to diminish. And then he said that I had never really been the type for the big swings, that I was steady, reliable. The kind of person who kept things running, rather than the kind who built something from nothing. My mother added in the soft and certain voice she reserves for things she considers simply true. Brooke's role was always different. She keeps the family together. Heard from the outside, it sounded like a tribute. I knew sitting in that car in the dark that it wasn't. It was a job description. Trevor had been given permission to fail and try again. Mallory had been given permission to want things, big things, without justification. I had been assigned a function, the person who holds the structure steady while everyone else lives inside it. And my parents had carried that assignment so long that they had mistaken it for my nature. They weren't being cruel. They had simply never questioned whether the arrangement was fair because it had never cost them anything to leave it in place. That was the moment everything clarified. I had spent years telling myself that if I was patient enough, if I contributed enough, if I stayed long enough without demanding recognition, something would eventually shift in how this family saw me. Sitting in my car with the footage running and that conversation still in the air, I understood that I had been waiting for something that was never going to arrive on its own. The shift wasn't going to come from staying. It was only going to come from what I did next. I closed that camera and found Mallory on the main feed again. She was walking through the entrance hall with the proprietary ease of someone who has decided a space belongs to her, and she stopped near the dining room doorway and looked around in a particular way, measuring, considering. She turned to Curtis and said that if tonight went unnoticed, they should think about coming back in a few months for her birthday. She said it practically as though it were already mostly decided. Curtis laughed and told her the caterers he used could do something much more elaborate with enough lead time. That was the moment the nature of the evening changed for me entirely. What had happened tonight might have started as a lapse in judgment. But what Mallory was describing was a pattern. She was treating a property that belonged to someone she had never considered as a venue. She had the right to return to because she had concluded that getting away with something once was equivalent to permission. I scrolled through my contacts and found Jocelyn's number. She answered on the second ring. I told her what was happening, kept it factual, and sent her the 3 most important clips from the folder while we were on the line. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said she was glad I had called before walking through that door a second time with more than 30 people inside. She was already pulling the ownership file. She told me she would contact the county sheriff's non-emergency line and request a unit to stand by at the property boundary, not to intervene, just to be present in case anyone refused to leave when asked. She would bring everything: the purchase agreement, the holding company documentation, the transfer certification, and the original recorded deed. That last document was the one that mattered most, she said, because it was the one piece of paper in the file that could not be argued with or explained away. A deed said one thing and said it completely. She told me to give her 40 minutes. I told her I would meet her at the gate. Before I put the phone down, I turned back to the main camera one last time. The party was still going. My father had moved to the center of the entrance hall and someone was calling for another toast. I watched him lift his glass and I watched the chandelier throw its light across all the faces below it. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked like they belonged. I turned off the screen. I waited for Jocelyn. And I let myself understand fully, and without looking away from it, exactly what I was about to walk back into. Jocelyn arrived at the gate in 38 minutes. She pulled up in her gray sedan, stepped out with a document folder tucked under one arm, and looked at the line of cars along the front drive without saying anything for a moment. Then she looked at me and asked if I was ready. I told her I was. She handed me the folder and said we would go in together, that she would stay close, and that I should let her take the lead on anything that turned procedural. I told her I understood. We walked to the front door and I put in the code and it opened. The music was still going. Someone near the back of the entrance hall had turned it up at some point in the last hour, and the sound filled the space in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. For a moment, nobody noticed us. I stood in the doorway of my own home and watched my family move through it, laughing, refilling glasses, comfortable in the way people get comfortable when they've been somewhere long enough to stop thinking about whether they should be there at all. Then Mallory turned and saw me, and her face did the thing it does when a situation isn't going the way she expected. She crossed the room quickly, positioning herself between me and the rest of the party. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice had the edge it gets when she's performing composure she doesn't fully have. I told her the property had sent me an alert, the same answer I had given an hour earlier because it was still true. Trevor appeared at her shoulder, drawn by the shift in her posture. He looked from me to Jocelyn and then back again, trying to determine what the presence of a second person carrying documents meant for the evening he had been having. Before anyone else could speak, my mother came through from the dining room. She took in the scene and came to the same conclusion Mallory had, that whatever this was, it needed to be contained. "Not tonight, Brooke," she said, her voice dropping to the register she uses when she wants to signal that a conversation is being closed. "This is your father's and my anniversary. Whatever it is can wait." I looked at her. I thought about everything I had heard over the last 2 hours, the way she had described me to her friend, the easy certainty with which she had defined my role in this family, and I recognized that she genuinely believed she was being reasonable. She did not know what she was standing in. I held on to that in order to stay calm. I walked to the long marble-topped console in the center of the entrance hall, set the folder down and opened it. Jocelyn positioned herself to my left. I found the deed and placed it on the surface of the table, turned it so it faced my father, who had made his way through the crowd and was now standing close enough to read it. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It went quiet the way rooms do when something shifts at the center and the edges slowly catch up. People near the table looked first, then the people behind them. The music kept playing for another few seconds, and then someone reached over and turned it off. My father read the document the way he reads everything, methodically, working through the holding company name, the transfer certification, the ownership record, the chain of documentation that linked the holding company back to me. When he reached the line that made it unambiguous, his expression didn't collapse. It reconfigured slowly like a building settling. Mallory stepped forward and looked over his shoulder. The color in her face shifted. "You wanted to know who owned this mansion," I said. "You're looking at her." The silence after that was the most complete the room had been all evening. It didn't last long. Curtis was the first to speak, coming at it from the angle I had expected, that there had been a misunderstanding, that nobody had known that the whole thing had been put together quickly and without full information. He said it reasonably, which is one of the things that makes him effective in the situations he creates. Mallory followed with a slightly different route. If she had known it was mine, she would have asked. Trevor said something I would not have believed if I hadn't been standing in front of him, that I should be glad tonight had happened the way it did, because our parents had gotten to celebrate their anniversary somewhere beautiful, and wasn't that worth something? I looked at him for a moment without answering. Then I reached past Jocelyn and picked up my phone. The large display screen on the far wall of the entrance hall was part of the integrated system the renovation team had installed. I connected to it in about 15 seconds, and then the camera footage began to play at a scale that left nothing ambiguous. Curtis's voice filled the room, first explaining the temporary gate code, laying out the logic of how they could use the property without consequence. Then Mallory at the foot of the staircase, talking about the apartment she assumed I was sitting in. Trevor's voice, easy and certain, explaining that I would always come back, that it was simply what I did. My parents in the far room. My father's casual acknowledgement that they had directed more of their attention toward my siblings because I hadn't required as much my mother's description of me as someone she didn't need to worry about. Then my father's old colleague raising a glass to Trevor and Mallory's futures, and the quiet that followed the question about me and my father's answer, steady, sincere, and entirely wrong. And then the library, the three voices, the story of the program, the verification call, the decision Trevor had made on my behalf without asking and without telling me. Nobody spoke while it played. When I stopped the footage, the room had the particular stillness of people who have heard themselves clearly and cannot find a way around it. The deed addressed the question of the property. The footage addressed the question of everything else. Jocelyn stepped forward and explained in the level and specific way she explains things that a formal record of damages to the property would be made that evening, that anything removed from the premises needed to be returned, and that a county unit was standing by outside if the process of clearing the property became complicated. She was not unkind about it. She was also not vague. My mother looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not anger, not defensiveness, but the specific discomfort of a person who has just been shown a version of events they had not known they were participating in. She started to say something, and then she didn't. I think that was the most honest thing she did that night. One by one, people began to gather their things. Curtis organized the removal of the rented equipment with the efficient head-down energy of a man who understands when a situation is over. Trevor and Mallory moved toward the door without looking at me directly. My father was one of the last to leave. He stood near the entrance for a moment, and I could see him working towards something, an acknowledgement maybe, or an explanation. Whatever it was, he didn't find it. He nodded once and walked out. Jocelyn and I spent the next hour going through the property room by room, logging every item of damage. The glass piece from the downstairs hallway had broken into 4 pieces on the tile floor exactly as I had expected. The carpet in the dining room had a red wine stain that would require professional treatment. 2 bottles from the refrigerator were gone. The East Wing hallway showed evidence that at least a small group had gone through despite the caution tape. In the days that followed, my phone was not quiet. My mother called 3 times in the first 24 hours. She didn't raise her voice. She said the right words. She was sorry, she understood why I was upset. But the architecture of each call was the same. She wanted me to let it go, to absorb it into the long record of things our family had moved past. My father sent a single message expressing regret and concern about the optics of involving a lawyer in something that was, he said, ultimately a family matter. Mallory called once and spent most of it explaining how my response had made things harder for everyone. Trevor didn't call because Trevor waits to see which way things settle before deciding where to stand. I recognized the shape of all of it. It was the same logic that had been applied to every difficult moment in our family's history. The person who raised the problem was the source of the disruption, and resolution meant that person absorbing it quietly. For most of my life, I had complied with that logic, not because I believed it was right, but because the cost of refusing had always felt larger than the cost of continuing. I understood now that I had been calculating that wrong for a very long time. I responded to each of them once and said the same thing in different words. I was not cutting anyone off. I was not punishing anyone. I was returning to each person the weight of their own choices, which was the only fair thing and the only thing that had any chance of changing anything. What I stopped doing, I stopped completely. I did not offer to cover Trevor's next financial shortfall. I did not step in when Mallory's planning fell through and she needed someone to take on the work she hadn't done. I did not serve as the family's default administrator, mediator, or emergency contact for situations that were not emergencies. The structure my family had built around my availability didn't collapse dramatically. It frayed. Without someone to redistribute the friction, things that had always been managed quietly began to surface. Disagreements between Trevor and Curtis that had been smoothed over before either of them had to fully own them, tensions between my parents and my siblings that had previously been routed through me. None of it was catastrophic. It was simply the ordinary difficulty of people carrying what they had always been responsible for, which had never felt like much when I was bearing the additional share. Several months later, the property was fully repaired. The carpet in the dining room had been replaced. The east wing was finished. The glass piece from the hallway was gone, and in its place I had put something I'd bought specifically for the shelf, a small framed photograph of the rear garden taken from the library window on an afternoon when the light came through at exactly the right angle. I had a small gathering to mark the move. Not a party, nothing that would fill the entrance hall the way it had been filled that night. A few people who had been with me through the harder years of the company, a couple of close friends, Jocelyn. Nobody asked what the property was worth. Nobody looked around the room tallying what might be available to them. People sat in the library and talked, and I made coffee in the kitchen I had designed myself, and for a few hours the house was exactly what I had bought it to be. When everyone left, I stood alone in the entrance hall. It was the same place where my family had stood and raised their glasses and laughed at the idea of me living somewhere like this. The chandelier threw the same light across the same floors. The deed was in the drawer in the study exactly where Jocelyn had filed it. I didn't need to take it out. I knew what it said and I knew what it meant, and I understood that the more important thing was not on any piece of paper in any drawer anywhere. It was the understanding I had finally stopped arguing myself out of that. I had built this, that I had earned it, and that the value of what I had made did not depend on anyone in that family recognizing it and never had. I turned off the light in the entrance hall. I walked to the front door and turned the lock, and I listened to the sound of it catching solid and final in the frame. For the first time in longer than I could accurately remember, I didn't feel like I was leaving anyone behind. I was just finally staying. If Brooke's story stayed with you, it might be because some part of it felt familiar, the exhaustion of being reliable, the quiet cost of always being the one who holds things together. The real lesson here isn't about a mansion or a deed. It's about understanding that the people who love you should never need you to stay small to feel secure. Setting a boundary isn't abandonment. It's the most honest thing you can do for them and for yourself. If this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.